Hello and welcome to this episode of the Brontë Network. Today I will be looking at Patrick Branwell Brontë, the Brontë brother, who led a life widely seen as fueled by alcoholism and ending in complete disappointment, especially when compared to the successes of his sisters. But today I want to challenge this rather negative view of the Brontë brother and instead see some of the ways in which his own life and works could be considered highly influential on the sisters themselves. Patrick Branwell Brontë was born on the 26th of June 1817, and his name came from his mother's side of the family, Maria Bramwell, before she married Patrick and became Brontë. And the Bramwells themselves led some rather interesting lives, with some tales of marital failure, bankruptcy, and all sorts of other things going on down in Cornwall, which is where the Bramwells came from. And of course, Aunt Bramwell came to live with the Brontës after their mother had died. And along with Anne, Bramwell was always their aunt's favourite, although when she died in the early 1840s, she did not leave Bramwell in her will. Sometimes this has been seen as a sign of disapproval, but instead it most likely shows the promise that she still felt that Bramwell possessed at this time, that he would be able to make his own fortune and wouldn't need her financial aid in the way his sisters might. In 1826, one of the most significant events in Bramwell's life occurred when his father brought home a set of 12 wooden toy soldiers. Now, this event has been widely discussed as kickstarting the Brontës' engagement with wars, insurrections and revolutions throughout their juvenilia. And for Bramwell in particular, these soldiers seemed to trigger a particular imaginative fervour, with him creating all sorts of stories of Napoleon and Wellington moving to Africa, colonising the locals, and engaging in violent bloodshed where many were killed. As well as contemporary politics, Bramwell would also have been highly influenced by contemporary print culture, with magazines such as Blackwood's, in addition to the local press, playing a particularly key role in his early imagination. Bramwell was also an accomplished scholar. He was taught at home by his father, who, being a self-made man himself, certainly valued the power of education. There were reports that Bramwell could write in Latin with his left hand and Greek with his right, and both equally fluently at the same time. Whether this is true or not, it does provide a wonderful insight into just how talented this young man was. From 1829 to 1830, all of the Brontës were taught art by John Bradley, a local Keighley artist, before Bramwell continued his studies under William Robinson, an accomplished artist in his own right. And certainly going into art was one of the most likely routes for the young Bramwell. In 1835, he wrote to the Royal Academy seeking admittance, and it's unclear whether he actually made the journey down or not. Winifred Guerin, amongst others, has speculated that Bramwell went to London but was so overwhelmed by its size that he was unable to cope and headed home after spending all his money on drink. Recently, however, critics have questioned Guerin's logic, instead seeing her as drawing on Bramwell's literature and applying an autobiographical reading to it, thereby assuming that because Bramwell wrote about a character who was overwhelmed in a large city, he must have therefore experienced this himself, which is clearly questionable. More recent scholars now question whether Bramwell made it to London at all, with many now thinking that Bramwell merely spent his money on drink in one of the local towns. Nevertheless, he was undeterred in his artistic career, and from 1838 to 9, he opened a studio in Bradford. And this was reasonably successful at first. However, as Bramwell's friend Joseph Bentley Leyland, the sculptor, found out, that if one was outside of London at this particular time period, there was neither the money nor the market for grand and expensive artworks, in Leyland's case sculpture, and in Bramwell's portraits, and work quickly dried up for Bramwell in Bradford, and he was forced to return home in slight debt. He worked briefly as a Sunday school teacher in the local school in Haworth. However, like all of his siblings, he was not naturally a teacher, and indeed there are all sorts of reports that he was cruel to his students. And indeed, a contemporary account by one of Bramwell's students, and later quoted by Guerin, describes his time going to church as part of his Sunday school teaching. Bramwell had a difficult relationship with religion throughout his life, with some critics seeing him as a defiant atheist, completely rejecting Christian teaching, whereas others argued that Branwell didn't so much abandon religion, but rather he felt that it had abandoned him, with a strong sense of spiritual despondency and even a fear of damnation emerging throughout his poetry. Now, returning to this anecdote from one of Bramwell's students, he claims that whilst Bramwell was forced to go to church, he would much rather sit staring out of the window and reading from some book that was not the hymn book than focusing on the service. And this certainly provides an insight into just how unwilling Bramwell was to accept his position as teacher. In 1840, Bramwell travelled to Cumbria to work for the Postlethwaites, and it was during this time that he struck up a friendship with Hartley Coleridge, son of Samuel Taylor. And in many ways they were similar characters destined to the same fate. They both ended up addicted to drugs and drink, and they both had family members who were far more successful than they ever could be. Although, of course, the Brontë sisters were not famous by this time. And it's certainly questionable whether Bramwell actually knew that his sisters were such celebrated writers. Whilst Bramwell was in Cumbria, there are some reports that he had an illegitimate child, again suggested by some of his literature, which references a father talking to his dead child up in heaven. However, beyond this, there is not a great deal of evidence to suggest that Bramwell fathered an illegitimate daughter, other than the fact that he was fired from the Postlethwaites shortly after, but this could really have been for any reason, even a simpler reason as Bramwell wasn't teaching up to the standard that was expected. After this curtailment to his tutoring, Bramwell then decided to go and work on the railways, an industry that was just in its infancy at this time, but over the 1840s was due to boom. One of Bramwell's poems, written from this time, captures the experience of working as a clerk vividly. What was that sound? 'Twas not a voice from ruby lips and sapphire eyes, nor echoed back from sensual joys, nor a forsaken fair one's sighs. I, when I heard it, sat amid the bustle of a town-like room, 'neath skies with smoke-stained vapours hid, by windows made to show their gloom. The desk that held my ledger book, beneath the thundering rattle shook of engines passing by. The bustle of the approaching train was all I hoped to rouse the brain, or startle apathy. So from this poem, written in 1841, Bramwell presents a vivid depiction of industrial life at this time, the town-like room, and the beautiful nature of the skies obscured through thick cloud. He presents an almost hellish vision of the railways. It was also over this time that Bramwell published his first poem. Bramwell had of course been writing throughout his life, but this was the first taste of success when he published Heaven and Earth in the Halifax Guardian. Heaven and Earth is in many ways an unusual poem for Bramwell, for it celebrates religion and the future life. It was also around this time that Bramwell published a prose piece on the Northumbrian artist Berwick, and it's a very interesting article because it foregrounds many of the concerns of Romanticism of the late 18th and early 19th century, specifically the poet's aim to find beauty within a single flower. So he's very much at this point showing his artistic debt to Romanticism and the poets associated with it, Shelley, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron. Significantly, Bramwell's article was the only one published within the Halifax Guardian from 1841 or 1842, and this perhaps goes some way to showing the regard in which they held Bramwell within, and indeed the quality of his work. However, this productive period in Bramwell's life was due to end in 1842, when he was dismissed from his job on the railway for irregular bookkeeping. And whilst there is no suggestion that Bramwell was in any way fiddling the books, the copious drawings and poems that can be found in the ledgers suggest that Bramwell was far more engaged in his art than he was the dull day job of balancing the books. After this, Bramwell went to work at Thorpe Greene in what is probably one of the most famous aspects of his life. It's still uncertain what happened whilst Bramwell was engaged as a tutor at Thorpe Greene, although the prevailing view is that he had an affair with his mistress, Mrs. Robinson. However, lately, people have begun to challenge this view, and certainly it doesn't fully add up. The fact that after dismissing Bramwell, Mr. Robinson threatens him with exposure certainly doesn't seem the behaviour of a man whose tutor was sleeping with his wife. Surely exposing your wife's infidelity with your children's tutor would be the last thing the respectable Mr. Robinson would wish to do. So what else could Bramwell have done? Well, some critics have argued that Bramwell had engaged in a homosexual relationship with one of the Robinson boys, and it certainly seems interesting that the aforementioned man on his death left all his money to his groom, suggesting maybe Bramwell was not his only homosexual relationship. Although of course this is pure speculation, this does provide some interesting insight into Bramwell's life and perhaps throw some fresh light on why he kept getting dismissed. Whilst it is questionable whether Bramwell had an affair with Lydia Robinson or not, there are nonetheless some interesting poems which may shed some light on the matter. For instance, Lydia Gisborne, written in 1846. Now, I'm not arguing for one side or another. I think that it remains a period of great obscurity, and probably we will never know what happened whilst Bramwell was at Thorpe Greene. But one thing is certain, it was after this time that Bramwell began the steepest slope of his decline, becoming increasingly alcohol and drug dependent. It was also over this time that Bramwell started work on his own 3-volume novel called And the Weary Are at Rest. However, Bramwell abandoned it after writing around a third. As a book, it represents a strange mixture of real life and the Angrian sagas of Bramwell's youth, and the two do not marry well together. It therefore seems appropriate that one of the last poems Bramwell was to write was titled The End of All, a poem like so much of Bramwell's work that focused on death and loss. And thus, in September 1848, Bramwell died, increasingly in poor health from drug and alcohol abuse, though it's written on his death certificate that he died of bronchitis, but there were probably other contributing factors as well. There is a widely quoted report that Bramwell died standing up as the final test of defiance, but there is in fact no evidence that this ever actually happened. There is no doubt that Bramwell's life was a tragic one, and a disappointing one as well. His early youth was filled with dreams of becoming a successful artist, poet or writer, but although he had limited success in all of these areas, he never really was able to make a career out of any of them. What's perhaps most interesting is that there is no evidence that any of his sisters knew that he was a published author, and this may sound unbelievable in such a close-knit community as Haworth, but over the time when Bramwell was first publishing in the early 1840s, Emily and Charlotte were in Brussels, and Anne was working in York, outside the reach of the papers that Bramwell published for. Therefore, it's entirely plausible that they simply had no awareness of this, albeit limited, successes that Bramwell achieved over his life. I think that Bramwell's poetry is worth studying in its own right. That's by no means to the detriment of his sisters, who were clearly far more accomplished than Bramwell was ever able to become, and whose work has been far more enduring and critically acclaimed. But that doesn't mean that Bramwell isn't worthy of independent study, and certainly many of his poems express moments of great genius and artistic strength. But even if you don't agree with me and don't feel that Bramwell's right is particularly worth studying on his own, it's nonetheless unquestionable that he was a central part of the Brontes' story. He set up Angria with Charlotte when they were both children and bounced ideas off one another. And certainly if one looks throughout Emily, Charlotte and Anne's literature, there are plenty of examples of how their work is either directly influenced by or working against the lifestyle that Bramwell led. As the only male of the Bronte family, Bramwell's perhaps greatest tragedy was that too much was put upon him. These expectations were always much higher than he was ever able to achieve. But whatever one makes of Bramwell's life, I think the words written by his friend Grundy after his death are the most accurate. Bramwell was no domestic demon. He was just a man moving in a mist who lost his way.